In 1800, a French immigrant arrived in the United States carrying something far more valuable than a fortune. He carried knowledge, knowledge of how to manufacture one of the most dangerous and valuable products of the age, gunpowder. His name was Eleuthère Irénée du Pont. Within a few years, he would establish a small powder mill beside the Brandywine River in Delaware. It did not look like the beginning of a dynasty. There were no palaces, no enormous corporate headquarters, no chemical laboratories, no sprawling family estates, only stone mills beside a river, wooden machinery, barrels of powder, and workers surrounded every day by the possibility of explosion. But from those mills would emerge one of the most extraordinary industrial fortunes in American history. The company founded by E.I. DuPont would supply explosives as the United States expanded across a continent. Wars would make the business larger. Railroads, mines, and construction would increase demand. The American Civil War would turn gunpowder into strategic power. And by the beginning of the 20th century, the DuPont family would control an explosives empire so dominant that the United States government would eventually move to break parts of it apart. But the dynasty did something many great industrial families failed to do. It changed. Gunpowder became high explosives. Explosives became chemistry. Chemistry produced new materials. And scientific research transformed a family powder company into one of the most important industrial corporations in the world. Along the way came extraordinary wealth: Longwood, Winterthur, Nemours, private estates, gardens, collections, trusts, and fortunes spread across an expanding family tree. But behind that wealth were battles over control. Cousins turned against cousins. The federal government challenged the company's power. War repeatedly enlarged the corporation. DuPont scientists helped create materials that entered millions of American homes. And during the Second World War, the company became involved in one of the most secret and consequential industrial projects in history, the Manhattan Project. Then, generations later, one descendant would attach the DuPont name to an entirely different kind of story. John DuPont, Foxcatcher, and the murder of Olympic wrestler Dave Schultz. Yet even that scandal could not define a family whose history already stretched across nearly 2 centuries. Because the most remarkable thing about the DuPont dynasty was not simply how much money it made, it was how long it survived. The Astors saw much of their concentrated family fortune fragment. Other Gilded Age dynasties watched mansions disappear, businesses pass into other hands, and descendants scatter. The DuPonts fragmented too. But they never simply vanished. Their wealth changed form, their company changed form, their estates became institutions, their descendants multiplied into separate branches. And the surname survived long after the family ceased controlling the corporation in the way its founder once had. So how did a French immigrant with knowledge of gunpowder create a dynasty capable of surviving more than 200 years? How did war transform one family business into an industrial empire? How did 3 cousins rescue that empire when it was almost sold? And how did a fortune built around explosives eventually produce scientists, politicians, philanthropists, magnificent estates, and one of the darkest scandals ever associated with an American dynasty? To understand that, we have to return to France, before the mansions, before the chemical empire, before the billions, before America even knew the name DuPont. Chapter 1, The Frenchman Who Came to America. Eleuthère Irénée du Pont was born in Paris in 1771. He was not born into the kind of industrial fortune his descendants would later possess, but he was born into an unusually intellectual and well-connected family. His father, Pierre Samuel Dupont de Nemours, was an economist, writer, and government official whose connections placed the family close to some of the most important political and intellectual circles in France. For young Irénée, however, the most consequential part of his education would come from chemistry. He studied under Antoine Lavoisier, one of the foundational figures of modern chemistry. Lavoisier was also involved with the French government's gunpowder administration. Under this system, Irénée gained experience in the manufacture of black powder. It was technical knowledge, specialized knowledge, and eventually extremely profitable knowledge. But France was approaching revolution. In 1789, the political order began to collapse. The DuPont family became caught inside the upheaval. Lavoisier himself would eventually be executed during the Reign of Terror. The world in which Irénée had been trained was disappearing. For the DuPont family, America offered an escape and a new beginning. In 1799, they left France. When they reached the United States in 1800, Irénée encountered a young country expanding rapidly, but still dependent on imported European expertise in many industries. And according to the story that would become central to DuPont history, he noticed something important about American gunpowder. Much of it was poor compared with the powder he knew how to manufacture in France. That weakness looked like an opportunity. Irénée did not need to invent gunpowder. He needed to make it better. He began searching for a location where he could establish a powder business. The Brandywine River near Wilmington, Delaware, offered almost everything he needed. Moving water could power machinery. The surrounding landscape provided space. Nearby ports connected the operation to commercial markets, and the rocky terrain could support the stone structures required for an exceptionally dangerous industry. In 1802, E.I. DuPont de Nemours and Company was established. The beginning was modest, but the product was not. America was growing, and a growing country needed explosives for clearing land, for construction, for mining, for infrastructure, and, inevitably, for war. Beside the Brandywine River, E.I. DuPont had positioned his family directly beside that demand. He could not have known how large it would become. But the first foundation of the dynasty was now in place. Stone mills, water power, technical knowledge, and gunpowder. Chapter 2, the mills on the Brandywine. The Brandywine mills were more than a factory. They became the center of DuPont family life. E.I. DuPont built his home close to the powder works, creating an unusual world where family, business, and danger existed within the same landscape. Below the house, water from the Brandywine powered the machinery. Inside the stone mills, workers processed charcoal, sulfur, and saltpeter into black powder. The buildings were deliberately separated from one another. An accident in one mill could become catastrophic if it spread. And accidents were not theoretical. Gunpowder manufacturing was extraordinarily dangerous. Explosions became part of life along the Brandywine. Workers were killed. Buildings were destroyed. Members of the DuPont family themselves lived with the knowledge that the source of their growing wealth could explode almost without warning. Yet, demand continued to rise. The young United States was expanding westward. Roads were being cut through difficult terrain. Canals were being constructed. Mines needed blasting powder. Settlers needed explosives to clear land. And the federal government needed reliable supplies of powder for the military. Then came the War of 1812. For DuPont, war demonstrated something that would shape the company repeatedly over the next century. Conflict could transform explosives from a commercial product into a strategic necessity. Government demand increased, production expanded, and the company became increasingly important to the young nation's supply of gunpowder. But the same mills generating wealth could also destroy it. In 1818, a devastating explosion tore through part of the Brandywine works. Dozens of people were killed or injured. For E.I. DuPont, the disaster exposed the brutal reality behind the fortune. The business could make the family rich. It could also kill the people who made that wealth possible. Still, the mills were rebuilt. Production resumed, and the company continued expanding. By the time E.I. DuPont died in 1834, he had accomplished something far greater than establishing a successful factory. He had created an inheritance built around an operating industrial enterprise. That distinction mattered. The next generation did not simply receive money. They received mills, workers, customers, technical knowledge, government relationships, and a family name increasingly associated with American gunpowder. But inheritance created another problem. Who would control it? The answer would help determine whether DuPont remained a successful regional powder manufacturer or became something far more powerful. DuPont's sons inherited responsibility for the business. Among the most important was Henry DuPont. Henry had been educated at West Point. He brought discipline, authority, and a distinctly different personality to the family enterprise. Under the next generation, DuPont continued expanding as America itself became more industrial. Railroads pushed across the country. Mining expanded. Infrastructure projects grew larger. Every tunnel blasted through rock and every mine driven deeper into the earth represented another potential market for explosives. Then, in 1861, the United States descended into civil war. And once again, the DuPont family found itself controlling something the country desperately needed: gunpowder. The scale of the conflict would push the family business into an entirely new era. Because the Civil War did not merely increase DuPont's sales, it helped turn the company into a national industrial power. Chapter 3: War Builds an Empire. When the American Civil War began in 1861, DuPont had already spent nearly 60 years manufacturing gunpowder. But nothing in its history compared with the scale of the conflict that followed. The Union needed enormous quantities of powder. Artillery consumed it, rifles consumed it, naval operations consumed it. And as the war expanded, reliable explosives production became essential to the survival of the federal war effort. DuPont was perfectly positioned. Henry DuPont strongly supported the Union. Under his leadership, the company became one of the most important suppliers of gunpowder to the United States government. The Brandywine mills operated under enormous pressure. Workers produced powder while knowing that a single spark, mistake, or mechanical failure could turn a workday into catastrophe. But the orders kept coming. By the end of the Civil War, DuPont had supplied a significant share of the powder used by Union forces. The consequences extended far beyond wartime profits. Government contracts strengthened the company, production capacity expanded, its reputation grew, and the DuPont family emerged from the conflict controlling an industrial enterprise more powerful than the one that had entered it. Yet war was only one source of demand. After 1865, the United States accelerated its transformation into an industrial nation. Railroads crossed enormous distances. Mining operations pushed deeper underground. Cities expanded. Tunnels, canals, and construction projects required explosives on a scale E.I. DuPont could never have imagined. Gunpowder was helping physically reshape the country. But technology was changing. Traditional black powder was no longer enough. New explosives were more powerful. Dynamite and other high explosives were beginning to transform mining and construction. For DuPont, this created a dangerous possibility. The product that had built the family fortune could eventually become obsolete. One member of the next generation understood the threat particularly well: Lamotte DuPont. Lamotte was a chemist and an innovator. Instead of treating the original powder business as something sacred, he pushed the family toward newer forms of explosives. He became involved in the development of blasting powder and later helped establish the Rapano Chemical Company in New Jersey, which became associated with the manufacture of dynamite and high explosives. This was an important shift. The DuPonts were beginning to learn one of the central rules that would keep their dynasty alive. Do not become emotionally attached to the product that made you rich. Adapt before someone else makes it irrelevant. But innovation remained dangerous. In 1884, Lamotte DuPont was killed in an explosion at Rapano. Once again, the industry that had created the family's fortune claimed the life of one of its own. His death was a reminder that enormous wealth had never separated the DuPonts completely from the physical danger at the foundation of their empire. By the end of the 19th century, however, DuPont was far larger than the operation E.I. DuPont had founded. The family controlled powder plants and explosives interests across an increasingly industrial America. The surname carried enormous commercial weight, and generations of relatives were now connected to the fortune. But this created a new weakness. The company was still deeply tied to family leadership, and family companies can become vulnerable when the generation in control disappears. That moment arrived in 1902. Eugene DuPont, then head of the company, died. DuPont was a century old. Its founder was long gone. Its ownership was spread through the family, and some shareholders were prepared to sell. For the first time, the dynasty faced a threat that could not be solved by producing more explosives. The company itself might leave the family's control. Then 3 cousins stepped forward: T. Coleman DuPont, Alfred Waj DuPont, and Pierre S. DuPont. What they did next would transform DuPont more dramatically than any generation since the founder. And it would trigger one of the most consequential family power struggles in the dynasty's history. Chapter 4: The Cousins Who Saved the Empire. In 1902, DuPont stood at a crossroads. The company was profitable. Its name was respected. Its explosives business stretched far beyond the original mills on the Brandywine. But after the death of Eugene DuPont, there was no obvious successor capable of holding the enterprise together. Some members of the family wanted to sell. Had that happened, the DuPont dynasty might have followed a familiar pattern. The family could have taken the money, divided the proceeds, and gradually become a collection of wealthy descendants living from an inheritance created by previous generations. Three cousins chose another path. T. Coleman DuPont, Alfred Wands DuPont, and Pierre S. DuPont organized a takeover of the company. Each brought something different. Coleman was aggressive and ambitious. Alfred understood manufacturing and had spent years close to the physical operations of the business. Pierre was analytical, financially sophisticated, and increasingly interested in modern corporate management. Together, they acquired control. And almost immediately, they began rebuilding DuPont. The old company had grown through generations of family ownership and individual powder operations. The cousins wanted something much larger. They began acquiring competitors. Explosives businesses were consolidated. Production was reorganized. Distribution became more efficient. Research became increasingly important. And management began shifting away from the loose structure of a 19th century family enterprise toward the centralized organization of a modern corporation. The transformation was extraordinary. Within only a few years, DuPont controlled a huge share of the American explosives industry. But success created another problem. The company was becoming too powerful to escape government attention. To competitors, DuPont looked increasingly like a monopoly. To federal regulators, it looked like the center of what became known as the Powder Trust. In 1907, the United States government brought an antitrust case against the company. The question was no longer whether DuPont could survive competition. It was whether the corporation had become powerful enough that the government would force it to surrender part of its empire. In 1912, the courts ordered a major restructuring. DuPont was required to divest important parts of its explosives business. From that breakup emerged companies including Hercules Powder and Atlas Powder. For many family dynasties, losing major pieces of a core business might have marked the beginning of decline. For DuPont, it became another adaptation. The company remained formidable, and Pierre S. DuPont was increasingly emerging as one of its most important figures. But the alliance among the three cousins was beginning to fracture. Coleman eventually reduced his involvement. Alfred and Pierre increasingly disagreed over control, strategy, and ownership. The men who had saved the company together were moving toward conflict with one another. Then events thousands of miles away changed everything. In the summer of 1914, Europe went to war. Within months, armies were consuming ammunition and explosives at an almost unimaginable rate. Britain, France, Russia, and their allies needed enormous quantities of military supplies. The United States had not yet entered the conflict, but American factories could supply those armies. For DuPont, the scale of the opportunity was unprecedented. A company founded beside a Delaware River to manufacture black powder was about to become one of the great industrial beneficiaries of the First World War. And the fortune created by that war would make the battle inside the DuPont family even more consequential. Chapter 5: War, Fortune, and the Battle for DuPont. When Europe went to war in 1914, DuPont entered a period of expansion unlike anything in its history. Modern warfare consumed explosives on an industrial scale. Artillery shells required propellants. Rifles required ammunition. Armies fighting across enormous fronts needed a constant supply of powder. The Allied powers turned to American manufacturers, and DuPont was ready. Orders poured in. Factories expanded. New production facilities were constructed. Thousands of workers entered the company's plants. DuPont's explosives output increased dramatically as the war continued. The financial consequences were enormous. A company already powerful before the conflict emerged from it with far greater resources and industrial capacity. For the DuPont family, the First World War represented another uncomfortable truth that had followed the dynasty for generations. War was extraordinarily profitable. The fortune had begun with a product designed to explode, and whenever nations went to war, demand for that product multiplied. But while DuPont was expanding overseas production for the Allies, another battle was taking place inside the family. The relationship between Alfred I DuPont and Pierre S. DuPont had deteriorated. At the center of the conflict was control of DuPont itself. When T. Coleman DuPont decided to sell a large block of company shares, Pierre and his allies moved to acquire them. The transaction helped strengthen Pierre's position. Alfred opposed the move. What had once been an alliance between cousins became a bitter struggle over ownership and authority. The conflict eventually moved into court. Pierre prevailed. Alfred's influence within the company declined. The episode revealed something important about the dynasty. Shared blood did not guarantee shared interests. By this point, DuPont was too valuable and too powerful for family relationships alone to determine its future. Pierre increasingly represented a new kind of leadership. He understood that DuPont could not remain simply an explosives company. The wartime boom had generated enormous profits. But wars end. If DuPont depended permanently on military demand, the company would remain vulnerable to the cycle that had enriched it. The fortune needed another future. Pierre began directing capital toward industries far removed from the powder mills. One of the most important was the automobile business. DuPont invested heavily in General Motors. Pierre eventually became chairman of GM and played an important role during a crucial period in the company's development. For the DuPonts, the investment represented diversification on an enormous scale. Explosives money was moving into automobiles. But an even more important transformation was taking place inside DuPont itself. The company began investing more aggressively in chemistry and scientific research. Instead of asking only how to manufacture existing products more efficiently, DuPont increasingly asked a more ambitious question: what new materials could science create? That question would change the company. It would also change the meaning of the DuPont fortune. By the 1920s, the dynasty's future no longer depended solely on the product E.I. DuPont had learned to manufacture in France. The next great source of wealth would not come from improving gunpowder. It would come from creating materials the world had never seen before. Chapter 6: From Gunpowder to a Chemical Empire. By the 1920s, DuPont was changing its identity. For more than a century, explosives had defined the company. Now science would. DuPont invested heavily in research laboratories and recruited professional chemists, engineers, and scientists. The goal was no longer simply to manufacture better explosives. It was to discover entirely new materials. One of the most important scientists to enter this world was Wallace Carothers. Carothers joined DuPont in 1928 and began leading research into polymers, enormous molecules whose properties were still being explored. The work was uncertain. There was no guarantee that fundamental chemistry would produce commercially valuable products. But DuPont had something few companies could match: money, laboratories, industrial capacity, and the patience to fund research before knowing exactly what it would produce. That combination eventually led to one of the company's most famous breakthroughs: nylon. In the 1930s, Carothers and his research team developed the synthetic polymer that DuPont would eventually introduce commercially. The implications were enormous. Here was a material created through chemistry rather than harvested from nature. It could be manufactured at industrial scale. It could become fiber, and it could replace materials on which consumers and industries had previously depended. When nylon stockings reached the American market in 1940, demand was extraordinary. Women lined up to buy them. A company whose name had once been associated primarily with gunpowder and explosives was suddenly connected to an everyday consumer product. And nylon was only part of a much larger transformation. DuPont's laboratories became associated with an expanding world of synthetic materials and industrial chemistry. The company's future increasingly depended on intellectual property, research, and scientific expertise rather than control of powder mills alone. This transformation also changed the nature of the dynasty's wealth. Earlier generations had lived close to the physical source of their fortune. The founder's house overlooked the mills. Later generations could live far removed from the factories generating their wealth. By then, the DuPont world included extraordinary estates. Pierre S. DuPont transformed Longwood Gardens into one of America's great horticultural estates. Alfred Fosdupont created Nemours, a mansion inspired by European grandeur. Henry Francis DuPont developed Winterthur into a remarkable estate and collection. The contrast was striking. The fortune had begun beside dangerous mills where explosions could kill workers without warning. Generations later, that wealth appeared in fountains, gardens, art collections, and enormous country houses. But the transformation from explosives to chemistry did not mean DuPont had escaped war. It meant that when the next war arrived, the company possessed something even more valuable than powder. It possessed scientific and engineering expertise on an enormous scale. In December 1941, the United States entered the Second World War. Nylon stockings would disappear from civilian shelves as synthetic fibers were redirected toward military needs. DuPont factories would again become part of the American war machine. And then the United States government approached the company with a project so secret that almost no one outside it understood what was being built. DuPont was about to enter the atomic age. Chapter 7, War, Science, and the Atomic Age. When the United States entered the Second World War, DuPont once again became deeply connected to the American war effort. But this war was different. The company was no longer simply a manufacturer of explosives. It had become a scientific corporation. Nylon, which had recently created enormous excitement among consumers, was redirected toward military uses. Synthetic fibers went into parachutes, cords, and other essential equipment. Chemical plants expanded production. Scientists and engineers worked on materials required by a war being fought across multiple continents. Then came a project unlike anything DuPont had encountered before, the Manhattan Project. The United States was secretly attempting to build an atomic bomb. Doing so required far more than theoretical physics. Scientists could demonstrate nuclear reactions in laboratories. But producing the necessary materials on an industrial scale required enormous facilities and engineering expertise. DuPont was brought into the project. The company became responsible for major engineering and construction work connected to plutonium production at Hanford in Washington state. The scale was extraordinary. A remote landscape was transformed into a secret industrial complex. Reactors had to be designed. Facilities had to be constructed. Processes that had barely existed outside experimental science had to operate reliably at industrial scale. DuPont brought decades of experience managing dangerous chemical processes and enormous manufacturing projects. In 1944, Hanford's B reactor began operating. Plutonium produced at Hanford would become part of the weapon used over Nagasaki in August 1945. For the DuPont story, the moment represented an extraordinary historical arc. In 1802, the company had begun by manufacturing black powder beside a river in Delaware. Less than a century and a half later, DuPont engineers were participating in the industrial infrastructure of the atomic age. The Second World War ended, but DuPont's scientific expansion did not. Post-war America created enormous markets for synthetic materials. Plastics, fibers, and specialized chemicals entered factories and homes. Products associated with DuPont research became part of modern life. Among the company's important discoveries was PTFE, later widely known through the Teflon brand, discovered accidentally by DuPont chemist Roy Plunkett in 1938 and developed into a valuable industrial material. The company had successfully escaped dependence on the product that created it. Gunpowder had built DuPont. Science allowed it to survive beyond gunpowder, but enormous corporate power continued to attract government scrutiny. DuPont's investment in General Motors eventually became the subject of another major antitrust battle. In 1957, the United States Supreme Court ruled against DuPont in a case involving its GM holdings, eventually leading to divestiture. Once again, the government forced the company to loosen its grip on part of an industrial empire. And once again, DuPont survived. By the middle of the 20th century, this pattern had become difficult to ignore. Wars ended. Products changed. Government intervention broke apart concentrations of power. Family control weakened. Yet the enterprise continued. Meanwhile, outside the factories and laboratories, the DuPont family had become something almost as remarkable as the corporation itself. It was no longer one household centered beside the Brandywine. It was a sprawling dynasty. Different branches possessed different fortunes, different estates, different ambitions, and increasingly, very different lives. To understand what the gunpowder fortune ultimately created, you have to leave the factory floor and enter the private world of the DuPonts. Chapter 8, Inside the DuPont World. By the middle of the 20th century, the DuPont family had become enormous. The founders' descendants had multiplied across generations, and the fortune that once revolved around a single company was spreading into different branches, trusts, investments, and estates. There was no longer one DuPont household. There was a DuPont world. Perhaps nowhere was that world more visible than in the estates the family created. Pierre S. DuPont had Longwood. What began as a country property became an extraordinary landscape of gardens, fountains, and conservatories. Pierre used industrial wealth to create something designed not to manufacture products, but to impress, entertain, and endure. Alfred Was DuPont built Nemours. Inspired by European architecture, the estate reflected the scale of wealth available to a man whose family had spent generations at the center of American industry. Then there was Winterthur. Henry Francis DuPont transformed the estate into a remarkable collection of American decorative arts. Rooms filled with furniture, ceramics, silver, and objects documenting American craftsmanship. Eventually, Winterthur became a museum. That transformation reveals something important about how the dynasty survived. Not everything was passed down as private property. Some family wealth was converted into institutions. Pierre supported education and other philanthropic causes. Alfred's fortune eventually helped establish a charitable legacy associated with children's health. Longwood became accessible to the public. Winterthur became a museum. Private wealth was slowly becoming public legacy. But the family was too large to move in a single direction. Some descendants entered politics. Some devoted themselves to horses and sport. Others managed investments or pursued private lives far from the corporation. And increasingly, sharing the surname DuPont did not mean sharing the same fortune. This is one reason the family's wealth can be difficult to understand. There was no single vault containing the DuPont fortune. No one descendant inherited everything. As generations multiplied, wealth fragmented, shares passed through families, trusts divided assets, estates changed hands. Philanthropy permanently removed portions of wealth from private inheritance. The dynasty became less concentrated, but it also became harder to destroy. If one branch lost money, the entire family did not collapse. If one descendant made disastrous decisions, hundreds of relatives remained unaffected. And if the corporation changed, the family already possessed wealth outside it. This was very different from a dynasty whose identity depended entirely on one mansion, one heir, or one concentrated fortune. The DuPonts had become a network. That network extended into American business, culture, philanthropy, and politics. But enormous inherited wealth also created another kind of environment. Some descendants grew up surrounded by estates, servants, trusts, and opportunities almost unimaginable to ordinary Americans. Most would never become infamous. One did. His name was John Eleuthère DuPont. He was born into one of America's most recognizable industrial families. He inherited extraordinary wealth. He became interested in natural science and athletics. And on his Pennsylvania estate, he built a private wrestling program called Foxcatcher. For a time, the project attracted some of America's finest wrestlers. Then the story became something much darker. Nearly 2 centuries after the first DuPont began manufacturing gunpowder beside the Brandywine, one of his descendants would make the family name famous for an entirely different reason. And this time, the explosion would not happen inside a factory. Chapter 9. Scandal Behind the Family Name. John Eleuthère DuPont was born in 1938. By the time he entered adulthood, the world that had created his wealth was already generations behind him. He did not need to build powder mills. He did not need to rescue a struggling company. He did not need to invent a new chemical product. The fortune already existed. John inherited enormous wealth and eventually controlled a large estate outside Philadelphia known as Foxcatcher Farm. He had serious interests in natural history and philanthropy. He also became increasingly fascinated by competitive wrestling. With money few private individuals could match, DuPont created an elite wrestling program on his estate. Foxcatcher attracted world-class athletes. Among them was Dave Schultz. Schultz was an Olympic gold medalist and one of the most respected figures in American wrestling. For athletes training at Foxcatcher, DuPont could provide facilities, financial support, and an environment built around the sport. But over time, concerns about John's behavior became increasingly serious. His relationship with the people around him deteriorated. And on January 26, 1996, the story reached its horrifying conclusion. John DuPont shot and killed Dave Schultz outside Schultz's home on the Foxcatcher property. Schultz's wife witnessed the attack. DuPont then retreated into his mansion. Police surrounded the estate. The standoff lasted for 2 days before he was taken into custody. The case became national news. Suddenly, one of America's oldest industrial surnames was attached not to chemistry, business, or philanthropy, but to murder. In 1997, Jean DuPont was convicted of third-degree murder and found mentally ill. He was sentenced to prison. He died there in 2010. The Foxcatcher case became one of the darkest episodes associated with the DuPont name. But it also demonstrated how dramatically the dynasty had changed. John DuPont was extraordinarily wealthy, yet he did not control the family. There was no longer a single family empire that one descendant could command or destroy. His crime damaged the name. It devastated the Schultz family. But financially, it did not bring down the dynasty. That is because by the late 20th century, the DuPont family had become too dispersed for the actions of one heir to determine the fate of everyone else. This is an important distinction. When people hear the phrase family dynasty, they often imagine one fortune moving intact from parent to child. But fortunes rarely survive centuries that way. Too many heirs appear, taxes intervene, businesses change, properties are sold, marriages divide assets, philanthropy removes capital, and descendants make different decisions. The DuPonts were subject to all of those forces. Yet the family name remained associated with wealth more than 200 years after the original company was founded. Not because every descendant remained rich, not because the family kept every estate, and not because it maintained permanent control over DuPont. The dynasty survived because, over generations, it had stopped depending on any one of those things. The company could change without destroying the family. The family fortune could divide without erasing every branch. Private estates could become institutions rather than disappear. And professional managers could run the corporation even as family control faded. The DuPonts had stumbled onto a form of survival that many older fortunes never achieved. They had allowed the empire to fragment without allowing the entire legacy to vanish. And that may be the most important reason we still recognize the name today. Chapter 10: How the Dynasty Survived. By the late 20th century, the DuPont dynasty looked almost nothing like the family E.I. DuPont had established beside the Brandywine. The founder had lived close to his mills. His wealth depended directly on the powder they produced. His family and his company were almost inseparable. 2 centuries later, those connections had largely disappeared. And strangely, that may have been exactly why the dynasty survived. The first secret was adaptation. The DuPonts never depended permanently on the product that created their fortune. Black powder became high explosives. Explosives gave way to chemistry. Chemistry produced synthetic materials. Scientific research created entirely new businesses. Each transformation reduced the danger of depending on an industry whose best years might already have passed. The second was professionalization. DuPont eventually became too large and complicated to operate simply as a family business. Professional scientists, engineers, and executives became increasingly important. The corporation developed systems capable of functioning without depending on a single brilliant heir. That meant the survival of the company no longer required every generation of DuPonts to produce another E.I. or Pierre. The third was diversification. Family wealth moved beyond DuPont shares. There were investments, real estate, trusts, collections, estates, and other assets distributed among different branches. The fortune became fragmented, but fragmentation also reduced dependence on one company. Then there was philanthropy. At first, giving away wealth might seem like the opposite of preserving a dynasty, but institutions can preserve a family name far longer than private consumption. Longwood Gardens survived Pierre S. DuPont. Winterthur survived Henry Francis DuPont. The charitable legacy created from Alfred Trans DuPont's fortune survived him. Instead of every generation being forced to maintain enormous private estates, some of those properties acquired purposes beyond the family itself. This helped transform private wealth into institutional permanence. But there was a price. The DuPonts gradually surrendered the concentrated control that earlier generations had possessed. There was no longer one fortune. No single patriarch controlled the entire dynasty. And the corporation carrying the DuPont name was no longer simply a private family enterprise. This is why asking whether the DuPont family is still powerful today produces a complicated answer. As a unified family controlling one industrial empire? Not in the way it once did. As a historical network of descendants, institutions, investments, and cultural influence created by more than 2 centuries of accumulated wealth? Absolutely. The dynasty survived by becoming less centralized, and that separates it from the popular image of old money. We often imagine preservation as keeping everything: the mansion, the company, the land, the shares, the family control. But over several centuries, keeping everything is almost impossible. The DuPonts survived because they repeatedly allowed pieces of the original empire to change form. Some were sold, some were divided, some became public institutions, some disappeared. Others became larger than anything the founder could have imagined. The result was not an untouched fortune. It was something more durable, a legacy distributed across many different places. And by the 21st century, even the corporation that carried the family name was about to undergo another enormous transformation. The final question was no longer how the DuPonts became rich. It was what, after more than 200 years, was actually left. Chapter 11. What remains of the DuPont Empire? More than 2 centuries after E.I. DuPont began manufacturing gunpowder beside the Brandywine, the empire he created no longer exists in the form he would have recognized. The powder mills are silent. The family no longer controls the corporation as a private industrial enterprise. And the enormous concentration of wealth and ownership once held by earlier generations has been divided across descendants, trusts, institutions, and investments. Even the company carrying the DuPont name has changed dramatically. In 2015, DuPont and Dow Chemical announced plans to merge. The merger was completed in 2017, creating Dow DuPont. But the combination was temporary. In 2019, the businesses separated again, producing independent companies including Dow, Corteva, and a new DuPont. The corporate structure had changed almost beyond recognition. The name survived, but the modern DuPont was no longer simply the family company E.I. DuPont had passed to his descendants. The family story and the corporate story had separated. For a dynasty, that might sound like decline. But look across Delaware and Pennsylvania, and another picture emerges. Longwood Gardens still survives. Pierre S. DuPont is gone, but the extraordinary landscape he created continues to attract visitors from around the world. Winterthur still stands. Henry Francis DuPont's private estate and collection became a museum, garden, and library. Nemours survived as well, and Alfred von DuPont's wealth helped create a charitable legacy connected to children's health. Then there is the place where everything began. The original DuPont industrial landscape along the Brandywine became part of the Hagley Museum and Library. The stone mills remain, the waterways remain, the family home remains. Visitors can still walk through the landscape where America's DuPont fortune began. This is perhaps the clearest way to understand what happened to the dynasty. The original empire fragmented, but many of its pieces did not disappear. They changed purpose. A private estate became a garden. Another became a museum. Industrial wealth became philanthropy. Company shares became diversified fortunes. A family-controlled business became a modern corporation. And one enormous inheritance became many separate family branches. There is no single DuPont fortune today that can be measured as though every descendant shares one bank account. Some branches retained enormous wealth. Others became far removed from the original industrial fortune. After more than 2 centuries, that is inevitable. Every generation creates more heirs. Every inheritance divides assets. Every charitable gift moves wealth permanently outside the family. The surprising part is not that the original fortune fragmented. The surprising part is how much of its legacy survived. In 1802, the future of the entire dynasty existed within a remarkably small landscape. A French immigrant, a river, a handful of stone mills, and a dangerous product America desperately needed. From that beginning came explosives factories, wartime fortunes, chemical laboratories, synthetic materials, enormous estates, and generations of descendants. The center eventually disappeared, but the consequences remained. And to understand the full meaning of that survival, there's only one place to return: the Brandywine River. Ending the river where it began. Along the Brandywine River, the water still moves past the place where E.I. DuPont began his American experiment more than 2 centuries ago. The powder mills are silent now. The workers are gone. The barrels of black powder no longer leave these buildings for mines, construction projects, or battlefields. What remains are stone walls, waterways, machinery, and the house from which the DuPont family once looked down upon the dangerous business creating its fortune. It is difficult to stand here and imagine everything that followed, because the beginning was remarkably small. E.I. DuPont did not arrive in America with an industrial empire. He arrived with knowledge. He understood how to manufacture gunpowder. America needed it, and beside this river, he turned that knowledge into a business. But gunpowder alone does not explain why the dynasty survived. Later generations repeatedly faced the same choice: protect what the family had built, or change it before the world changed around them. They chose change. Black powder became high explosives. Explosives became chemistry. Chemistry became synthetic materials. A family business became a professionally managed corporation. Private fortunes became trusts and investments. And some of America's grandest private estates became gardens, museums, and philanthropic institutions. Each transformation weakened the connection to the original empire, but each also helped something survive. The DuPont story was never clean. Workers died in explosions. Wars generated enormous profits. Corporate power brought government intervention. Family members fought over control. And generations later, extraordinary inherited wealth produced one of the darkest scandals associated with an American dynasty. But dynasties are rarely simple stories of success or collapse. The DuPonts demonstrate something more complicated. A family fortune does not need to remain intact to survive. Sometimes survival requires fragmentation. The company can leave direct family control. The fortune can divide. The mansions can stop being private homes. The descendants can move in different directions. And still, something remains. Today, there is no single DuPont empire comparable to the one earlier generations controlled. But there are institutions, estates, museums, gardens, fortunes, descendants, and a corporate name whose origins reach back more than 2 centuries. Perhaps that is the real achievement of the dynasty. The DuPonts did not preserve everything. They preserved enough for the name to survive. Enough for the consequences of the original fortune to remain visible. Enough that more than 200 years later, we can return to the same river and still see where it began. A French immigrant, a handful of stone mills, and one extraordinarily dangerous product: gunpowder. The empire changed, the fortune fragmented, the family multiplied, but the name endured, and it all began here, beside the Brandywine, built on gunpowder.